The Fair Act is officially law in New York City, and it is changing the process of renting in New York City. So if you are apartment hunting in New York City and looking to rent something, you're going to want to stick around for this entire video so that you have a full picture of how you are going to be affected. But is the Fair Act really fair? Well, we're going to look at some of the pros and cons of the new law, and you can decide for yourself. But first, I'm Dewey Moss. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button, and let's get started. So the Fair Act went into law last week after great debates and great protests against and protests for. On the whole, consumers, people who are renters and tenants in New York City, are looking at this as a positive change. However, sometimes they may not be looking at the entire picture. I want to stress that nobody has a crystal ball and can tell the future. So we do not know how the Fair Act is going to affect the rental market in the long term. We'll probably look at numbers in about a year and really see what's going on. So nobody can tell you that it's a great thing. Nobody can really tell you that it's a bad thing either. But we can look at some of the pros and cons in the immediate after effect of the Fair Act going into law. Now, the first thing you need to know about the Fair Act is that this applies to all residential rental buildings in New York City. There are no exceptions there. So every residential rental in New York City is affected by this law. It affects a number of processes. We'll go through some of that, but the main thing that it affects is how commissions are paid in New York City. And here is the big thing that has caused all of the controversy, and it has a lot of really good sound bites in terms of making it feel like this is going to be a good thing for the tenants. But let's talk about the reality of this. And to understand the changes, you need to understand how commissions were really being paid in the not so distant past. If you've ever rented in New York City, you would go on some of the sites like StreetEasy and Zillow and RentHop, those sites where you can find rentals, and you would see certain listings that would say no fee or fee apartment. Right? Does that sound familiar? If you're not familiar, that's how the old way was. Now, everyone would try to go after these no-fee apartments, naturally, because they didn't want to pay an agent's commission. Agent's commissions can be up to 15% of an annual year's rent, but understand that has been and will always be negotiable. Some agents may not want you to believe that, but it is the truth, and that's one of the big points of the Fair Act too. Commissions are fully negotiable. But people would go after these no-fee apartments thinking they were getting a bargain. But in reality, there was always a commission being paid. It was just a matter of who was paying it. In the case of the no-fee apartment, it was being paid by the landlord or by the large property management company. And that seemed like a good idea until you understand that the commission was being amortized into your rent. The landlord was wanting to recover that cost to them. And when your rent goes up the following year, or the following 2 years, depending on the length of your lease, then that increase would happen on top of the rent, which has that amortized fee in it. So in other words, you're paying more rent because there's an amortized amount included in your no-fee apartment. Now, if you were looking at a fee apartment, that either meant that the landlord's agent who had the listing, represented the listing and advertised the listing, was going to charge you 15%, or you were working with an agent that represented you that would co-broke with that landlord's agent, right? And they would split that commission, and oftentimes it was 15% of an annual year's rent. Could have been 1 month, but they would split that commission. Either way, the landlord did not have to pay the agent that was representing them. Now you may think, well, why would I have ever paid that fee when I could go for the no-fee apartment? Well, if you really sit down and do the math, you would see that that fee is paid once and it is separate from your rent. So it was never amortized into your rent. You're paying less than you would have in that no-fee apartment that amortized those fees into the rent. So that is how the rental market has previously worked. Now, we can sit here and debate the fact that rents are too high in New York City. That's not the purpose of this video. I myself rented for many, many years in New York City. I've been in New York City for 32 years. I am an owner of a co-op now, and I love owning my co-op, but I understand the struggle that renters go through, and I understand how high rents are. That's not up for debate. But that is part of the talking point of the Fair Act. Advocates are saying that it's going to decrease the rent. People are actually saying, no, it's not going to. It's going to just add to your rent. And here's the real reason why they're saying it. Now, according to the Fair Act, whomever hires the agent must pay the agent if the listing is advertised publicly. So what does that mean? Well, if a landlord hires an agent to advertise and to rent the apartment, then they must pay that agent's commission. It can no longer come from the tenant. That part I actually think personally is a good thing. If you hire someone to do a job, shouldn't you pay them? Why would somebody else pay them? So I think that that's a good thing. However, the talking point is that landlords are just going to absorb that cost and take it as a loss because they're going to need to rent their apartment. You also, as a tenant, still have a right to hire an agent to represent you. And there are all sorts of benefits for having an agent that solely represents your interests. They can find things that you may not be able to find. They can help you in terms of all the scheduling. They can help you prepare your paperwork in a competitive environment. They understand the market and can really help you work through that. But again, if you choose to work with an agent that represents you, then you will need to pay the commission. And that commission is fully negotiable between the two parties. So all of this sounds good, right? If the landlord hires an agent, then the landlord is going to pay that agent. If you, as a renter, hire the agent, then you're going to pay your agent. And as a result, if you now go on StreetEasy or Zillow or RentHop, anything that you see advertised that is on a public-facing website must be basically a no-fee apartment. It means that the landlord now pays the commission. So any rental you see, you have to assume that the landlord is paying that agent and that you, as a renter, will not need to pay that agent. And guess what? That includes any social media posts. So if you see rentals for listing on Craigslist, if you see it on Facebook, if you see it on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, anywhere that something might be advertised, then it is an apartment that the landlord must be paying their agent, assuming that the landlord has hired an agent. Now, that all sounds right, doesn't it? It sounds really terrific. If you hire an agent, you should pay your agent. If the landlord hires an agent, they should pay the agent. Here's a bit of the issue with that and why I explained how no-fee apartments worked, because it factors into what may happen in the real estate market now. Proponents of the Fair Act are arguing that this is actually going to decrease rents because it's going to become more competitive. There are going to be less fees paid to agents, and landlords, if they are paying that fee, are just going to absorb that cost because they need to remain competitive. That sounds great. In reality, we already have an example of what has happened with all the no-fee apartments in the old way of renting, and that was it was amortized into the rent, causing rents to go up. Landlords in New York City are business people. They want to pass as many costs off as they can to the tenant so that they make the maximum amount of profit that they can on any units that they have. So from my opinion, and opinions are just opinions, again, I'll say we don't know what's going to happen, but in my opinion, this may very well cause rents to go up because many landlords are still going to want to use agents to represent them, agents who understand how to advertise and can have the time to show the apartments and get them rented for them. That is a good investment for landlords to make, but they are going to amortize that into the rent, and ultimately the tenant will have to pay that on a higher rent. And then when the rent goes up, you're actually going to be paying an increase on that fee as well. Additionally, there may be an increase in renters wanting to use their own personal agent to represent them, which would mean that there would be an extra cost because you would have to pay that agent. Now, why do I say that? Well, the Fair Act states that anything that is publicly advertised on any public-facing website, so as I said, that includes StreetEasy, that includes Zillow, that includes Rent, Rent Hop and all the social media channels. If you are advertising there, then the landlord is paying the commission. But what if the landlord doesn't want to pay a commission but still wants to use an agent? Well, they could still hire an agent to represent them, but the listing would have to remain off market, out of the public view. They could then still charge a co-broke fee to anyone coming in or a fee directly to the tenant because they haven't advertised it publicly. So that may mean that there may be a lot of apartments taken off the market and kept off market, and the agents would just have to get on the phone and talk to people about the fact that they have some off-market listings. Now, ironically, in the sales market, there's been a movement to keep most listings on the market. Again, some of this does apply to sales listings, so there's not a lot of off-market inventory for you to look at. But in this case, in the rental market, this may create a very large off-market inventory, and as a renter, the only way you may know about that is by calling around to different agents and asking, do you have anything off-market? Show me. Or hiring your own agent who's going to have access to other agents to be able to call them and arrange any off-market tours. In either case, there's most likely going to be a fee for any of those off-market listings, and it's not going to be the landlord that's paying for it. So whether or not you contact their agent directly or you have an agent that represents you, most likely you're going to have to pay the commission. Now, let's talk about another aspect of the Fair Act that is actually quite positive in my opinion, and that is that all fees and charges must be disclosed to the tenant in the advertising. So when you log on to these websites, when you see something on TikTok, it must provide you a breakdown of every possible charge that you will incur. If that's a condo or a co-op, that must include all the application charges and the board package charges that you may incur. If it is just a regular rental, then that includes all of the application fees, all of the move-in fees, any administration fees. They all must be disclosed. Then it takes it a step further. Before you sign a lease, you must receive an itemized list of all the charges, and you must sign off on that before you sign a lease. So it takes the guesswork and surprises out of it. You as a renter will absolutely know upfront all of the charges that you will incur and be able to weigh that against the other apartments that you may be considering. That's an important fact. It's a great level of transparency, and that is definitely one of the pros of the Fair Act. So there are some pros and cons about the Fair Act, and you yourself can decide if it's fair. So what have we seen in the immediate after effect of the law going into effect, which has only been a week as I record this video, but I can tell you that already there have been a huge number of listings to come off the market as landlords decide what they're going to do, which makes the rental market more competitive right now. And in addition to that, there have already been a lot of price increases. So if you go on some of these websites, you're going to see the rentals have gone up in price more than they usually do in the rental season, which is right now. In the summer months is the primary rental season. As competition happens, you would always see the rents going up, but these rent increases are directly because the landlords now must pay the commission. So you are going to see rentals already going up in price. So again, we don't know what's going to happen within the next year or so. I'm sure we'll have some good data, and I will be here to share that data with you so that you have a clearer understanding, as we all will, of how the Fair Act is going to affect the New York City rental market. I hope this was informative and helpful. If you have any questions or have any thoughts, post them in the comments below. And again, I'm Dewey. I'm your New York City real estate resource. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button, and I'll see you next time.